I'm not one to claim authority on a lot of subjects, but I would say that I'm a fairly experienced fan of stealth games. Technically, my first one was Splinter Cell Pandora Tomorrow on GBA, but Chaos Theory on Xbox is what cemented my love for the genre. Before this, I was accustomed to games like Halo, Blinks, and the butt-ton of Star Wars games I had. I didn't really know how to play a game where you don't approach every enemy head-on, but it was such a thrilling experience for me that I still love and appreciate as a grown woman. Mechanics such as regulating movement to stay quiet and slapping a guy in the face when up close came naturally to me, but something that I didn't quite get right away was how guns worked. The expectations of how an enemy would react to gunfire that were implanted in my brain by the shooters I played suddenly no longer came into play. It was far too easy to aim a shot only for the bullet to just graze their face or not be able to kill them quickly enough for me to maintain a full health bar. And this was a game where being seen by the enemy was punishing. Guards had no trouble aiming at me, there were no regenerating shields, and health pickups were a lot more scarce and precious than what I was used to. It was something I had to adapt to, and that made it all the more rewarding to pull it off in the end. I've replayed Chaos Theory more times than you can count. I've done ghost runs, full alert runs, 100%, 0%, pacifist, no mercy, and everything in between. And I can tell you that if gunning down everyone in sight was made easier, it would not have been as gratifying. Of course, I had to branch out. I've played every mainline Splinter Cell and Metal Gear, I've sunk over 500 hours into the Hitman World of Assassination trilogy, I've played other games with stealth elements, games where stealth is optional, and games with shoehorned stealth sections. So while there's still tons for me to try, I think I can safely proclaim myself as a bona fide fan of the genre. Of course, the more you branch out in any genre, the more you'll notice how different games like to toy with the elements in different ways. Some stealth games have you play as a ninja, or otherwise ninja-like figure, others have you play as a secret agent. In some games you gotta use your tools and talents to survey the area before moving forward, other games make sure you have all the information needed shoved in your face at all times. But I think that's a topic much greater than a single genre and wouldn't be easy to talk about right now, so the big discrepancy I want to discuss is the varying usage of guns in stealth games. Before anything else, I think establishing why guns, such loud and gratuitous forms of weaponry, became ubiquitous in the genre of stealth of all things. Much of it stems from the theming. An easy way to imagine a scenario in which the player would have to remain out of sight is for it to be an operation carried out by a soldier or secret agent. In other words, the kind of guy who'd be packing heat every night. You gotta have methods of dispatching foes, and of course, while it may not always be clean or elegant, guns have the versatility, range, and power to get the job done. But guns aren't exactly known for being silent, so games will take different approaches in their implementation. The most obvious solutions are to make guns a loud backup plan for when you've already been caught, or to make them silent so that you can shoot one guy in the corner without the whole navy finding out. It's been like this ever since the original Metal Gear. You'd find a pistol and an SMG which cause an alarm when used, but then you can find a silencer, so you can still take out guys quicker and from a distance. You'll find other weapons that can't be silenced, but you really don't get much use of them outside of boss battles. Later games in the series got more creative with it. The solid games have a much greater variety of guns you can use, some of which can be silenced, others can't. This, plus more nuanced enemy AI and more varied types of enemies to avoid, made for something a lot more fleshed out and thought-provoking. MGS3 even went as far as to make silencers degrade over time, forcing you to collect a bunch if you plan to rely on them. Splinter Cell has always just had silenced guns to start you off, no need to procure weapons on sight. Sam's a government agent like Snake before him, but his missions aren't as sensitive or grandiose. Though that doesn't mean he can't get cool rifle attachments like sticky cameras, still silent but used to serve as a means of surveying the area and distracting guards. In later entries, he even gets shotgun and sniper rifle attachments, alternative firing methods that make tons of noise but one-shot everyone in your path. Of course, both of these franchises offer hand-to-hand options as well if you wish to minimize how much lead goes around, or even just for a self-imposed no-guns challenge. But beyond that, there is still a lot of meticulous balance and design implemented by the developers. The very act of holding a gun and aiming it at a target is something that the video game industry does pretty much the same all the time nowadays. But back in the early days of mainstream 3D gaming, devs got a lot more creative and experimental with it. Shit was so unstandardized that when Alien Resurrection for the PS1 came out as one of the first games to use modern twin-stick aiming, critics were flabbergasted. I think Halo CE the following year was the first game to really set this control scheme into stone, but that didn't mean other games couldn't get creative with it even then. After the MSX games letting you run and gun with minimal consequence and MGS1 stopping in your tracks to fire a few shots, MGS2 and 3 let you aim in first person as you take a shot. Previous games didn't really take the hit location into account, but these games had guards who would react differently depending on where they're shot and what kind of bullet hits them. Normal ballistic rounds will cause them to flinch from the frays, and in some cases even remain injured after the fact. So if you don't have the mad skill to get a headshot every time, you can use rapid pistol shots like so. Just keep an eye on your ammo and make sure you actually get the kill, or they'll be chasing you down. Tranq guns cause an instant KO on headshot, while body shots will make them drop out cold after some time passes. I'm not quite sure how the timing formula works, but from my understanding, the farther it is from the head, the longer it'll take to do its thing. Shoutouts to Peace Walker for introducing the rectal insertion method though. That's the one nice thing about Peace Walker I'm going to say in this video. But that's just the behavior of the guns themselves. The important part that needs highlighting is how aiming works. When in third person, you kinda have to let the not so reliable auto aim do its thing. This is better for when you just need to take a shot really quick or if you're in a run and gun situation. In first person, you're stuck in one place and your aim is rather delicate. If you move the stick all the way in one direction, it's gonna gradually reach max speed rather than just snapping to it, which makes coarse aiming really difficult, thus incentivizing you to focus on more fine aiming. I can get why this isn't everyone's cup of tea, but it does contribute a lot to how you approach each situation. If the gun controls were more like a competitive shooter, it would be too easy to rely on taking guys out from afar. But because you have to stop and take your time carefully, it becomes an option that has to be weighed up against others, and subsequently becomes more satisfying when you make it work out. Sam Fisher's guns don't work in quite the same way, but they fulfill a similar role. In the early Splinter Cells, enemies rarely if ever flinch from a body shot. Rather, they will be instantaneously alerted and open fire on you with a level of aimbot which varies based on difficulty selection. In lieu of Tranq guns, you have a very limited supply of sticky shockers which cause an instant KO even on body shot, and airfoil rounds which sometimes cause a knockout, sometimes stun them for a bit. I've been playing these games for 20 years, I still have no fucking clue how these work. But the point is, these easy way out rounds are in such short supply that relying on them isn't viable. Unlike Metal Gear, you line up your shot more similarly to a traditional third-person shooter, but the faster you move your aiming reticle, the more out of focus your bullet will be, and the longer it'll take to refocus, as shown by these lines that move away from the center. So again, careful and precise aim is key. You can feel the rush of suspense as you take aim, knowing that a little too much air will cause a massive jump scare, likely followed by immediate death. Now I realize that there are tons of stealth games out there that force you to utilize the tools given to you in interesting ways, but these two franchises are the ones I'm most familiar with, and thus are the ones I wish to focus on, especially seeing how they've both went down similar roads with time. I think the only opinion in the Splinter Cell community more commonly held than Chaos Theory being the peak of the franchise is viewing Conviction as the awkward turning point where nothing would be the same again. The main reason for this are the game's shift in focus to being more action-oriented and simplifying so much of the game to the point where it was essentially just an okayer version of Uncharted. Stealth fans know what they like, and when an established franchise begins to stray from what created its following, it's gonna get some odd looks. If Metal Gear Rising is any indicator, it's better to fully lean into gratuitous action if you don't want to make a stealth game. Allow the game to spread its wings in one way or the other. Get the most of what you can out of one design philosophy instead of awkwardly trying to balance several conflicting ideas at once. Of course, Conviction still has stealth mechanics, but gunning everyone down is so damn easy that even bothering to stay out of sight feels like a waste of time. Unlike previous entries, aiming is much more fluid, enemies stumble all over the place, you have unlimited ammo on pistols, and to top it all off, one of the game's biggest selling points is giving the player free aimbot. Oh, but you had to get an unarmed kill first. Yeah, big fucking challenge that is. Blacklist went to great efforts to try and recapture the appeal of traditional stealth games while still keeping things familiar enough for Conviction fans, but I think that had mixed results. It was nice that they prioritized player choice, but most of these changes to gunplay, while mitigated by things like armored enemies, still exist. I'm glad the Mark and Execute is just completely disabled on the hardest difficulty though, even they knew that shit was broken. The game does still usually require some level of stealth and non-aggression, it's just a shame that they couldn't have gone further with that. While this doesn't get as much discussion concerning Metal Gear, I think there's something to say about its evolution too. After MGS 2 and 3 had gunplay that was so easy to mess up yet still tight and satisfying, MGS 4 settled for more traditional third-person shooter controls. Even the button scheme matches contemporary shooters of that era. You can also move around while aiming, so you aren't as committed to your position. Now it is true that these changes make it a lot smoother, but the question I'd like to raise is, does it complement a stealth game? To me, the restrained nature of aiming your weapon is a big part of what makes it so satisfying. Not because the shooting feels good, but because the difficulty it introduces forces you to be more tactical about it. Otherwise, the box should just say espionage action. This also makes holdups easier, where instead of having to stop at the right point, you can just crouch walk towards them from the side. Peace Walker kept this same aiming style practically unchanged, but then 5 added a free bit of bullet time if you got spotted. I know this was done as a bit of an equalizer to give you a leg to stand on in the more open spaces you have to sneak through, but in practice, it effectively makes getting spotted by the enemy oftentimes meaningless, and in some cases, even preferable to sneaking through. Now, I'm no game design guru, but if you ask me, system mechanics that make the player want to get caught are not good design for a stealth game. Unless it's based on The Dark Knight Rises, then it's fine. Curiously, despite the series being the pioneer of the stealth genre, Metal Gear fans don't seem to take much issue with these changes. You'd think the Metal Gear fandom would be more smug about their franchise always having a good balance of stealth and action, but nope, they seem fine with it. I mean, to each their own, but if you ask me, traditional gun controls in a stealth game can only go so far until they blur the line between a stealth game with third-person shooting and a third-person shooter with stealth. This doesn't necessarily ruin the game, and mixing genres isn't a sin by any means, but I think that a stealth game works best when it knows what it is and designs its mechanics with a clear focus in mind. Some wiggle room is fine. I wouldn't have fallen in love with Chaos Theory as a kid if it hadn't been so flexible with its level design and mechanics, but the reason it all works so well is because it still poses the kind of challenge that I expect to see from a stealth game. If I'm in the mood for a really raunchy, inelegant style of play, I'll happily plow through a game just killing everyone in my path with little regard for stealth. Is this easier than a ghost run? Usually yes, but it isn't always a walk in the park either. The reason I want to be sneaky in the first place is because even a single guard can potentially be a huge threat if I get too careless. If I want to take him out with CQC, I need to watch my step and make note of his patrol pattern. If I want to shoot his ass, I need to take the difficulty of aiming into account as well. When gunning a guy down poses no challenge, it becomes routine. It's about as satisfying as hitting a cardboard cutout. Now there are still arguments to be made in these games' favor. For example, MGS5's gun silencers don't last all too long, and refills don't come very easy, so you have a resource that needs to be managed sparingly, which serves as a neat limiter for firearms. The higher enemy count also greatly disincentivizes being loud, as any alert is going to get you bombarded from all directions. Oh wait, no, silly me, I just remembered you can call in a supply drop at any time and refill your silencers there, whoopsie! Also, you have Quiet, who can just play the game for you if you want her to. Yeah, I love modern AAA games. Even MGS4 has its stress meter, an active punishment for the player who intentionally wants to get into a gunfight. Snake's an old-ass man in this game, and genetically engineered super soldier or not, his heart can only take so much. Too much stress will cause your psych gauge to go down, and if it's completely drained, you're more susceptible to being stunned when taking damage. And when that happens, it won't take long for your foxy grandpa days to come to a close. Conviction's pretty goddamn indefensible in this regard, but Blacklist has its scoring system which heavily favors the ghost playstyle, giving you more upgrade points for non-lethal takedowns and even more for reaching a checkpoint with all enemies left undisturbed and unharmed. The game even ranks you in each of its 3 playstyles separately. There are unfortunately a lot of instances where you're practically forced to play in one way or another, but I still think it's really neat that the game not only wants you to play in your way, but in every way. It also should be noted that your non-lethal weapons don't have a lot of range and aren't as accurate as regular pistols and rifles, so it won't trivialize the ghost run. So it's clear that a stealth game can still have engaging challenges whether or not it has traditional third-person shooter aiming. Making something simpler isn't such a bad thing when you're focusing on other aspects. It's just part of the big balancing act known as game design. It's not my preference, but it's understandable for developers to go in this route as it's the one that's easiest for most people to get to grips with. However, what I really dislike is the notion some people have that this direction is just objectively better or that the old way is just outdated and obsolete. Much of what I've talked about in this video is also applicable to the horror genre, aka games that I'm way too much of a pansy to play or even look at. Famously, Resident Evil 4 was the first game in its series to try and be more of a serious action game with light horror elements rather than relying on the intentionally stiff camera and controls to create suspense. While it is more in line with a traditional third-person shooter, the controls still maintain a level of stiffness so that nailing each enemy with bullets can remain challenging and tense. The Wii version famously had pointer controls that were so damn smooth that the game became much easier, and to many, more enjoyable. I only played a little bit of RE4 for this video, so I don't really have a horse in this race, but nevertheless, there are arguments for both aiming styles. If you don't care so much for the worries that come with stiffer controls and you just want to have fun blowing faces off, that's great. But personally, I think it's better when it's an option like in most re-releases of this game, unlike what other franchises do. If I had a nickel for every time a Metal Gear game was re-released on a Nintendo system with mechanics of later entries slapped onto it with no regard for how it affects the game balance, I'd have 2 nickels. Yeah, you heard it here first, folks. Twin Snakes is far from the best remake, and the 3DS port of Snake Eater is not the ideal way to play this game. I'm not here to tear apart the weird cutscene direction Silicon Knights went for, nor am I to state that 10 FPS is a bad frame rate. Instead, I want to focus on how they changed the central mechanics. Twin Snakes is a very, let's take the old game and make it play more like the new game kind of remake, which is not my preferred style, as it's oftentimes completely ignorant of why the original game was designed the way it is. MGS1 security cams could be pretty tough to get by because of how tight the corridors are, and guards were often spread apart because it was tough to get rid of them without getting close. But when you plop MGS2's first-person aiming on top of it, that's when you've successfully torn the game to shreds. I don't mean to say this makes the game bad, just that it severely undermines the way in which it was originally designed. Had they done more to offset it, like adjust the room layouts and guard patrols to justify this change, then this may have been more palatable. But as is, it's like bringing a chess queen to a Chutes and Ladders board. MGS 3D's changes may not be quite as egregious, but they are still pretty damn questionable. For some reason, they didn't think the crystalline perfection of the original game's controls were good enough, so they decided to make it play more like Peace Walker. Once again, it's done in a way that completely misunderstands the original game's design intentions. Where you originally had to choose between aiming precisely with your feet placed firmly or run around blind firing, now you just get to go full Nathan Drake in the Russian jungle. You'll be hard-pressed to find anyone who thinks the changes made to Twin Snakes are an upgrade, but I've actually seen people say that MGS 3D's control scheme somehow makes it the definitive version. I can understand finding the differences novel, or expressing how it has its own merits, but how are you gonna tell me that this makes the game better? The same can be said about the addition of crouch walking, which modders added to the Master Collection re-release. I think the mod existing is pretty neat, but I hate people saying that this is an essential improvement that you must download, as if it just fits perfectly into how the game was designed. Now, in all fairness, both of these instances were just one-offs whose changes weren't retained in later re-releases. Hell, immediately after the announcement of an MGS3 remake, they announced a straight-up port of the original game, so it's not like they're completely burying their past. But the fact that they seized the opportunity to make these changes in the first place does raise some concern for me about how they view their legacy. Also, fun fact, both of these happened years before Kojima's departure. Hey, while I was editing this, they put out a new trailer for the MGS3 remake. This is just MGS3's scenario with MGS5's gameplay. What is the point of this? The original's perfect the way it is. This remake's just as pointless and unnecessary as I thought it would be. Good lord. There are plenty of ways in which a game can be remade or remastered, but I really don't like when they effectively devalue what made those early games so great to begin with, as it carries a cadence of regretful revisionism. Like the old design philosophies and control schemes are completely obsolete and need to be thrown out entirely. Although, as disappointing as it is for me, I'm not blind to the reasons studios go in this direction. As time goes on, as franchises evolve, publishers want to have a wider reach with every new game they put out, and one way to achieve that is to encourage design choices that will appeal to the largest crowd of people. Whether we want to admit it or not, stealth is a niche genre, and if there's one way to make a stealth game appeal to more people, it's to emulate the control scheme of one of the most mainstream and commonly understood genres in the industry. New fans will appreciate the more approachable gameplay, and existing fans are generally fine either way, even if they did see appeal in the older, harder way of doing things. As much as I love to complain both ravenously and eloquently, I ultimately can't be mad at anyone who decides to make games more like that. It may not be entirely for me, and rarely does it flat out ruin my experience, but it's clear that they seek to expand their target audience far beyond the niche that was there from the beginning. I mean, it's not like I'm allowed to bitch, I didn't play Metal Gear until 2015. You ever played Portal with the cheat code that gives you all the weapons from Half-Life 2? It's a pretty fun thing to dick around with, but it also kind of fucks up the whole experience. Not having weapons force the player to solve problems creatively. Likewise, it's definitely fun when a game of any genre gives us a ton of useful options to overcome a challenge, but I think we owe more appreciation to the dynamics created from giving the player limitations. I always love when a sequel or a remake can impress me with all the new things I can do, but I also have a lot of respect for the things that I can't do. Metal Gear and Splinter Cell are both franchises with very bleak and uncertain futures. Maybe Sam Fisher can be used for something other than a crossover someday. Maybe that MGS3 remake will allow new Metal Gear games to be made again. Maybe either franchise will get a good game. I really have no idea. But no genre is ever truly dead, so hopefully my words may reach someone out there, indie or AAA, and get them to be a bit more mindful about how they want their games to be played and what they can do to achieve that vision. It doesn't have to be exactly how I like it, but if a developer wants to make a pure stealth game that can only be played one way, or something more versatile where you can play the game however you want, there can be a balance struck between upholding tradition and being inventive. And if you like this video, give it a like, subscribe if you like hearing my unwarranted opinions, and leave a comment telling me how you solve problems creatively.